In October 1958, a Boeing 707 carrying 111 passengers and operated by Pan American World Airways lifted from Idlewild Airport in New York and flew to Paris. An army band played on the tarmac. President Eisenhower had attended the christening ceremony 9 days earlier. The aircraft was called Clipper America. 67 years later, the name of that flight is still cited in every serious account of how commercial aviation began. The Douglas DC-8 entered scheduled service 11 months after that, on the 18th of September 1959. And outside of the airlines and the engineers who operated it, almost no one remembers the date. The DC-8 was not a worse aircraft than the 707. By several operational measures, it was a more considered one. It flew for over 3 decades across nearly every continent, carried hundreds of millions of passengers, survived re-engining programs that extended its working life well past those of its famous rival. And as of January 2026, at least one example was still hauling freight in Congo. It was, by any reasonable engineering assessment, a serious and capable jet. It just never became a cultural object. The question the DC-8's career raises is not whether it succeeded, it did, but why the 707 defined the jet age in the public mind, while the DC-8 defined it only in the flight operations records of the airlines that trusted it most. The answer has something to do with timing, it has more to do with Boeing, and it has most to do with the two companies' entirely different starting positions when the jet race began. Donald Douglas ran the most successful commercial aircraft manufacturer in the world in 1952. His company had built the DC-3, which had all but created the modern airline industry, and had followed it with the DC-4, DC-6, and DC-7, 4-engine piston transports that carried the majority of American airline passengers through the late 1940s and into the 1950s. Douglas had nearly 300 orders on hand for the DC-7 when the jet question first became serious. The backlog was real money. The piston program was working. Donald Douglas Sr. was not convinced the airlines were ready for jets, and the Comet disasters of 1953 and 1954, 3 aircraft breaking apart in flight due to metal fatigue around pressurized windows, seemed to confirm his caution. Boeing had no such backlog to protect. Its commercial division was modest. Its military division was not. Boeing had designed the B-47 Stratojet and the B-52 Stratofortress, 2 swept-wing jet bombers that gave its engineers more practical experience with large jet aerodynamics than any commercial manufacturer could claim. In 1952, Boeing President William Allen committed $16 million, everything the company had earned since the war, to build a single prototype jet transport. That prototype was the 367-80, later known as the Dash 80, and it flew on the 15th of July, 1954. When Pan American placed simultaneous orders for 20 707s and 25 DC-8s in October 1955, Boeing had an aircraft that had already flown. Douglas had a project office and a very large piston order book. The DC-8 that came out of Long Beach on the 9th of April 1958 rolled out before an audience that included Donald Douglas Sr. in the left seat on the flight deck, his son Donald Jr. to the right, was the result of 3 years of catch-up engineering that was also, in several specific ways, genuinely thoughtful. The wing was swept at 30 degrees rather than the 707's 35. Douglas chose the shallower sweep deliberately. It gave better low-speed handling and reduced a tendency toward yawing instability. The fuselage was wide enough for 6 abreast seating from the beginning, a detail that Boeing initially resisted until Pan American's Juan Trippe pointed out that Douglas had already designed one. The aircraft flew for the first time on the 30th of May, 1958, with Chief Test Pilot Arnold Heimerdinger in command for a 2-hour, 7-minute flight mostly over the Pacific. The 707 had flown 5 months earlier. The DC-8's development cost Douglas $450 million and took the company to the edge of what it could manage. The production schedule was aggressive almost to the point of recklessness. To meet delivery commitments, Douglas was building aircraft before testing was complete, and Ship 14 for Delta was finished 2 weeks before the DC-8's first flight. When Heimerdinger landed after that maiden flight, the engineers already knew they had a problem. Initial drag measurements came in 13% above estimates and 10% above the performance guarantees Douglas had given airlines. The first production aircraft cruised at Mach .798, well below the guaranteed Mach .84. The company had committed $450 million and could not afford to miss. Harold Adams, the chief designer at Douglas Aircraft, who worked the program through this period, described the situation plainly in later interviews. Boeing had advantages Douglas had not fully accounted for. Boeing had already designed and flown two large swept-wing jets before the 707. Boeing's close relationship with the U.S. Air Force through the KC-135 tanker program meant the military had already absorbed much of the development cost. The unit price on the 707 was approximately $500,000 lower than the DC-8, around 10%, partly because the KC-135 line spread Boeing's fixed costs across a much larger production run. American Airlines, which had operated Douglas aircraft for decades and might have been expected to stay loyal, chose the 707 partly on price and partly because Boeing's 5-month head start in flight testing was not something Douglas could argue away. Douglas's response to the drag problem was methodical and technically disciplined. Engineers developed a new wing leading edge geometry, extending the chord by 4% and reducing drag at cruise. Unique leading edge slots, covered by doors that opened for takeoff and landing and closed in cruise, improved low-speed lift. A revised wingtip reduced drag and increased range. By the time FAA certification arrived in August 1959, Douglas had used 10 separate aircraft in testing, an unusually large fleet for the era. The engineers solved the performance shortfall without abandoning the design. Don Jr., who had become company president in October 1957, held the program together through a period in which 10 vice presidents resigned or were removed, in what Fortune magazine later described as a bloodbath at Santa Monica. The DC-8 that entered service with Delta Airlines on the 18th of September 1959, Delta Flight DL-823, New York to Atlanta, 119 passengers, first departure at 9:20 in the morning, was a different aircraft from the one Heimerdinger had taken out over the Pacific 15 months earlier. C.E. Woolman, Delta's founder, cut his hand on the champagne bottle at the celebration and kept talking. United Airlines' first DC-8 flight left San Francisco for New York the same day. Between them, the two carriers cut transcontinental flight times by up to 40% compared with the DC-7s and DC-6s they were replacing. A Delta DC-8 flew the Los Angeles to Atlanta route in 2 hours and 57 minutes on the 8th of March 1962. The previous record had been set by a propeller aircraft. By March 1960, Douglas was producing 8 DC-8s a month. The customer list that had built up since 1955 read like a directory of the most demanding airlines in the world: United, Delta, KLM, Swiss Air, SAS, Japan Airlines, Air Canada, Alitalia. These were not airlines taking a punt on an unknown product. They were carriers that had studied both jets, made a deliberate choice, and planned their route networks around what they expected the DC-8 to deliver. The 707 was selling faster. Boeing would produce 856 passenger variants against Douglas's 556 DC-8s, but the DC-8 was selling to the airlines that flew the routes that mattered most. By the way, if you're into stories like this, subscribing takes 2 seconds, and there's a lot more coming. On August 21, 1961, test pilot Bill Magruder took a Douglas DC-8-43, registered N9604Z, to 52,000 feet above Edwards Air Force Base, with Chuck Yeager flying alongside in an F-104 Starfighter. Magruder pushed the aircraft into a half-G dive. At around 45,000 feet, the DC-8 passed Mach 1.012, about 668 miles per hour, and stayed supersonic for 16 seconds before recovering at 35,000 feet. It was the first intentional supersonic flight by a commercial airliner. Magruder later said the point was simple: prove the DC-8 could survive those loads before Boeing attempted the same with the 707. Boeing never did. The dive was never meant as a performance stunt. The aircraft later entered normal passenger service with Canadian Pacific Airlines as Empress of Montreal. What the test really proved was how much structural strength Douglas had built into the DC-8, strength that would matter later as the aircraft evolved far beyond its original design. To passengers, the DC-8 felt different from the 707. The windows were larger. The cabin, especially in first class, felt unusually spacious. United passengers on Hawaii routes later described it as one of the most comfortable cabins of the era. Delta even gave its early DC-8 interiors star-filled ceiling panels and custom carpets to emphasize the futuristic atmosphere. It was smooth in cruise, but like every first-generation jet, it was loud. The early Pratt & Whitney turbojets were powerful enough that conversation near the rear cabin could become difficult, helping push airports toward the first serious noise monitoring programs. Pilots noticed differences too. The DC-8's shallower wing sweep made it more stable at low speeds and less prone to Dutch roll than the 707. Douglas had deliberately prioritized controllability over absolute speed, and pilots often described the aircraft as feeling built for serious airline work rather than glamour. But none of that mattered culturally. The 707 became the symbol of the jet age. It carried the Beatles to New York in 1964. It appeared in films, advertisements, and travel campaigns that sold the romance of modern flight. The Pan Am globe on a 707 tail became part of the era itself. Douglas gave the DC-8 a second life in 1965 with the Super 60 series. The DC-8-61 stretched the fuselage by 36 feet and could carry 259 passengers, more than any single-aisle airliner until the Boeing 757-300 decades later. The DC-8-62 added a larger wing and more fuel for long-range routes. The DC-8-63 combined both ideas: long body, long range, high capacity. The program worked because Douglas had designed the DC-8 with enough structural margin from the beginning. The fuselage, wing structure, and landing gear could handle major growth without a complete redesign. Delta's stretched DC-8s carried 50% more passengers while increasing operating cost by less than 10%. Then came the next threat: noise regulations. By the late 1970s, the original JT3D engines were becoming obsolete under new Stage 3 noise rules. Rather than retire the aircraft, Douglas leadership backed a re-engining program using the new CFM56 high-bypass turbofan. Between 1982 and 1988, 110 Super 60 DC-8s were converted into the quieter, more efficient Series 70 aircraft. The new engines extended the aircraft's life by another 15 to 20 years. The Boeing 707 never made the transition as successfully. By 2002, only around 80 of the 1,032 Boeing 707s and 720s built were still in commercial service, most as military conversions. Meanwhile, roughly 200 DC-8s remained active, many of them re-engined Super 60s and Super 70s. Passenger airlines eventually retired them, Delta in 1989, United in 1991, but cargo operators kept flying DC-8s deep into the 2010s. As of early 2026, at least one DC-8-73 was still operating freight flights in Central Africa. The DC-8 was never romanticized like the 707 because it was never designed to be a symbol. Douglas built it the same way it built the DC-3, DC-4, DC-6, and DC-7, as a machine airlines could depend on. Boeing won the public imagination because the 707 arrived first, and Pan Am turned it into the image of the jet age. But the DC-8 won differently. It kept working, for decades longer than almost anyone expected. And that kind of victory is harder to photograph. If this story was worth your time, hit like and subscribe, and drop your thoughts in the comments.